My name is Leo Maxwell, and I am 34 years old. This is not a fact that thrills me, nor does it particularly dismay me. It is simply a number, a marker of time spent accumulating responsibilities, a mortgage, and a quiet, unshakable sense of being settled. I am the operations supervisor for a high-end events firm, a job that suits my temperament. I wrangle chaos into order. I am the calm voice on the radio when the lighting rig fails, the steady hand that signs off on a 1,000-page logistics manifest. I make things happen seamlessly and silently. My life, much like my work, runs on a predictable, well-oiled schedule. It is a machine I built myself, designed for maximum efficiency and minimum emotional turbulence. 2 years ago, that machine had a different co-pilot, Sarah. Our relationship didn't end with a bang. There was no screaming match, no dramatic betrayal. It ended with a quiet sigh in the kitchen of our shared apartment, the scent of her lavender hand soap hanging in the air like a ghost. "Leo," she had said, her voice gentle, which was somehow worse than if it had been angry. "It's just this. It's always just this. It's safe. It's comfortable." She said the word comfortable like it was a terminal diagnosis. "I need more," she'd finished, her eyes pleading with me to understand something I fundamentally couldn't. She wanted fireworks, spontaneity, a life that looked good in a social media montage. I offered her consistency, a perfectly balanced budget, and the quiet assurance that the bills would always be paid on time. I was the reliable sedan, and she wanted a sports car. She eventually found one in a rock-climbing instructor named Kai. I did not begrudge her that, but her parting words had etched themselves into my psyche. Safe, predictable, boring, they became the quiet hum of the engine in my well-oiled life, a constant reminder of my own perceived limitations. So I leaned into it. I became the master of my quiet kingdom, a king of logistics and solitude, guarding my heart with the same meticulous care I used to plan a gubernatorial gala. The memo that landed on my desk was a declaration of war disguised as a corporate directive. Project Nightingale, a week-long, ultra-exclusive corporate retreat for a tech behemoth at the ridiculously opulent Blackwood Manor, a resort nestled on a private island off the coast. It was the kind of event that made careers. And, of course, they had assigned 2 project leads. Me, for operations and logistics, and her, Clara Reyes. Clara was my professional rival, my ideological opposite. Where I built foundations, she designed facades. Where I saw potential problems, she saw exciting challenges. She was the lead project manager, the client-facing charmer, the one who sold the dream. I was the one who had to figure out how to build it in reality without the whole thing collapsing. Our meetings were legendary for their polite, surgical disagreements. We were 2 master craftsmen arguing over blueprints, each convinced our way was superior. She was sharp, impossibly quick, and possessed a wit that could slice through boardroom bravado like a scalpel. And if I were being brutally honest with myself, in the sterile, fluorescent-lit confines of our office, she was the only spark of unpredictable color in my grayscale world. Which is why I found myself sitting next to her on a cramped regional jet, the air thick with the smell of recycled oxygen and stale coffee, feeling a current of anxiety that had nothing to do with my fear of flying. We were on our way to Blackwood Manor for the initial site inspection. Up close, away from the buffer of a mahogany conference table, she was different, more real. She wasn't wearing her usual armor of a perfectly tailored blazer. Instead, it was a soft, worn denim jacket. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple, efficient knot, but a few rebellious strands had escaped to curl around her ear. She was focused on a tablet, her brow furrowed in concentration, her lips pursed in a way that was both intimidating and, to my secret dismay, utterly captivating. I watched the way her fingers flew across the screen, the decisiveness in every tap. She didn't just work, she commanded. I was used to observing her from a professional distance, analyzing her strategies. But here, with our elbows practically touching, my observations felt dangerously personal. I noticed the faint, almost invisible scar that cut through her left eyebrow. I noticed the way she chewed on her lower lip when she was deep in thought. I noticed the scent of her perfume, something clean and green, like fresh-cut grass after a rainstorm, a stark contrast to the sterile air of the cabin. It was a scent that promised open spaces and wildness. Everything my carefully curated life was not. I felt a familiar, dull ache in my chest. The ache of the sedan driver admiring the sports car, knowing he could never keep up. The ferry ride to the island was a blur of salt spray and the cry of gulls. Blackwood Manor rose from the mist-shrouded cliffs like something out of a Gothic novel, all dark stone and gleaming windows that seemed to watch our approach. It was imposing, beautiful, and probably a logistical nightmare. I could already feel a headache forming behind my eyes. The lobby was a cathedral of wealth. A fireplace large enough to roast an ox crackled merrily, its warmth a welcome contrast to the damp sea air. The scent of wood smoke, beeswax, and old money hung heavy in the air. A young, impossibly cheerful woman with a dazzling smile greeted us at the polished oak reception desk. "Welcome to Blackwood Manor," she chirped. Checking in, Clara, ever the professional, stepped forward. "Yes, reservations for Reyes and Maxwell. 2 rooms." The receptionist tapped at her keyboard, her smile never faltering. Her brow furrowed for a fraction of a second before the smile brightened, becoming almost blinding. "Ah, yes, Mr. and Mrs. Maxwell. We have you right here. And it looks like you've been given a complimentary upgrade for your special occasion." She winked, a gesture of conspiratorial delight. My brain short-circuited. "Excuse me." I managed, my voice sounding strangled. "There must be a mistake. It's Maxwell and Reyes. 2 separate rooms." The receptionist's smile faltered, replaced by a look of polite confusion. She peered at her screen. "Oh, it says here 1 booking. For the celestial honeymoon suite." The words hung in the opulent air, seeming to echo off the vaulted ceilings. Honeymoon suite. My blood ran cold. This was a disaster. A logistical, professional, and deeply personal disaster. I opened my mouth to launch into a full, systematic correction of this catastrophic error, to deploy the calm, authoritative voice I used when a vendor sent us 500 white roses instead of 500 red ones. But before I could utter a single syllable, a warm hand landed on my forearm. Clara's hand. Her touch was light, but it sent a jolt through my system that shut down my entire thought process. I looked at her. Her expression was a carefully blank mask, but her eyes, those sharp, intelligent eyes, were dancing with a dangerous, mischievous light. She leaned in close, her voice a low murmur meant only for me, the scent of her perfume suddenly overwhelming. "Don't you dare correct them. Ich stehe hier, utterly bewildered." "What?" "Clara, they think we're married. They've given us the honeymoon suite." "I am aware," she whispered back, her lips twitching with the effort of suppressing a smile. "Think about it, Leo. The celestial suite. It's their best room. It will have the best view, the best amenities, the best vantage point for surveying the grounds. It's a strategic advantage. Besides," she added, her eyes glinting, "it'll be fun to watch you squirm." And with that, she turned back to the beaming receptionist, her own smile now rivaling the other woman's in its brilliance. "Thank you so much," Clara said, her voice smooth as silk. "That is so thoughtful. My husband is just a little tired from the trip. He gets grumpy." She squeezed my arm, a gesture that was probably meant to look affectionate but felt more like a warning. I was speechless. Trapped. Leo Maxwell, the master of control and contingency planning, had been completely outmaneuvered. I could only stand there, a briefcase in one hand and a profound sense of doom in the other, as the bellhop loaded our luggage onto a cart. He led us towards a private elevator, and I followed in a daze, acutely aware of Clara's hand still resting on my arm. She was right about one thing. I was definitely squirming. The elevator ascended in unnerving silence, the soft chime of each passing floor marking another step towards my impending professional and personal doom. The celestial honeymoon suite was, to put it mildly, obscene. The door opened into a sprawling living area with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the tumultuous sea crashing against the rocks below. The furniture was a mix of modern elegance and antique charm. A plush velvet sofa, a polished mahogany desk, and a fireplace that was a smaller, but no less grand, version of the one in the lobby. There was a fully stocked bar, a dining area, and a balcony that looked large enough to host a small cocktail party. And then I saw it. Through an arched doorway, in the center of the adjoining bedroom, sat the bed. It wasn't just a bed, it was a geographical feature. A vast, king-size behemoth draped in what looked like $1,000 worth of white linens and an absurd number of pillows. It was unapologetically, aggressively romantic. It was the only bed in the entire, sprawling suite. My throat went dry. "Well," Clara said, her voice laced with an amusement she wasn't even trying to hide. She strolled into the room, dropping her bag on a luggage rack. "I was right. The view is spectacular. We could see the entire North Lawn from here. Perfect for mapping out the welcome reception." She was all business, her tone crisp and professional, but it did nothing to dispel the screamingly awkward reality of our situation. I stood frozen in the entryway, my briefcase handle slick with sweat in my palm. "Clara," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "there is one bed." She turned to face me, leaning against the doorframe of the bedroom. She crossed her arms, a genuine, full-blown smile finally breaking through her professional facade. It transformed her face, softening the sharp angles and making her eyes sparkle. It was like watching the sun come out from behind a cloud. It was terrifying. "Your powers of observation are, as always, impeccable, Leo," she said. "I'll take the left side. You can have the right. Or the couch, if you're feeling chivalrous. Your choice." She disappeared into the cavernous bathroom, the sound of the door clicking shut echoing in the sudden silence. I was left alone with the giant bed, the roaring fireplace, and the crushing weight of my own inadequacy. This was a scenario so far outside my carefully constructed parameters that I didn't even have a protocol for it. My mind, usually a seamless engine of logic and planning, was just a mess of static and panic. I sank onto the velvet sofa, which was so soft I felt like I was being swallowed by it, and put my head in my hands. This was not a strategic advantage. This was a Category 5 hurricane, and I was standing right in the eye of the storm. We established a fragile truce, a set of unspoken rules for cohabitation. We divided the closet space. We negotiated bathroom schedules. We treated the king-size bed like a demilitarized zone, a vast, empty territory neither of us dared to cross. We spent the afternoon working, spreading blueprints and vendor catalogs across the large dining table, our conversations strictly limited to floral arrangements, seating charts, and audiovisual requirements. It was almost normal, if you ignored the champagne on ice and the complimentary rose petals scattered on the nightstands. As evening approached, the question of dinner loomed. The thought of navigating the hotel's formal dining room, of potentially having to continue our charade as the Mr. and Mrs. Maxwell, was enough to give me hives. "We need to eat," Clara stated, looking up from a catering menu, "and I refuse to subsist on a complimentary fruit basket. We should go down to the restaurant. We need to assess their service quality anyway." She was right, of course. It was part of the job, but every social interaction felt like a minefield. Still, I nodded my agreement. "Fine. But we're sticking to business." "Wouldn't dream of anything else, darling," she quipped, her eyes twinkling as she disappeared into the bedroom to change. The casual endearment, though clearly sarcastic, landed like a physical blow. The restaurant was exactly as you'd expect. Low lighting, hushed tones, the clink of expensive silverware on fine china. We were seated at a secluded table for two, near a window overlooking the manicure gardens. The maitre d', a man who exuded an air of professional condescension, had seated us with a knowing smile that made my skin crawl. The entire situation felt like a performance, and I was an unwilling actor who hadn't learned his lines. We tried to keep the conversation focused on work, dissecting the menu from a catering perspective, critiquing the wine list. But the intimacy of the setting kept intruding. The candlelight softened the sharp, professional edges of Clara's face, making her look younger, more vulnerable. I found my eyes lingering on the way the flame danced in her dark pupils, on the curve of her smile, as she described a particularly disastrous event from her early career. I was learning things about her, small, personal details that had no place on a project timeline. I learned she hated cilantro, that she had a younger brother who was a musician, and that she had once spent a summer backpacking through Southeast Asia. Each new piece of information felt like a secret I wasn't supposed to have. It was in the middle of her story about a monsoon in Thailand that the evening took a turn. A man appeared at our table, materializing out of the dim light like a villain in a play. He was tall, handsome in a slick, overpolished way, and wore a suit that probably cost more than my car. His smile was wide and predatory. "Clara," he said, his voice a smooth, confident baritone that set my teeth on edge. "I thought that was you. I almost didn't recognize you without a phalanx of assistants." Clara's posture stiffened. The warmth drained from her face, replaced by a cool, guarded mask. "Julian," she said, her voice flat. "What are you doing here?" "Scouting for the OmniCorp conference," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "Same as you, I imagine. Though I have to say, I'm surprised to see you here." His eyes flicked over to me, a slow, deliberate appraisal that was clearly meant to be insulting. He didn't even bother to acknowledge my existence beyond the glance. He turned his full attention back to Clara. "And I'm even more surprised to see you slumming it with the logistics guy. Didn't your company spring for a better dinner companion?" The insult was so blatant, so dripping with condescension, that for a moment I was just stunned. The logistics guy, he'd reduced my entire career, my entire identity, to a dismissive footnote. The old Leo, the one who had internalized Sarah's verdict of being boring and safe, would have shrunk. He would have gone quiet, let the insult land, and spent the rest of the night replaying it in his head. But something inside me snapped. Maybe it was the ridiculousness of the honeymoon suite. Maybe it was the way Julian had extinguished the light in Clara's eyes. Or maybe, just maybe, I was tired of being underestimated. I didn't get angry. I didn't raise my voice. I leaned back in my chair, picked up my water glass, and took a slow, deliberate sip. I met Julian's smug gaze with a look of mild, academic curiosity. "Logistics is a fascinating field," I said, my voice calm and even. "It's the quiet art of making sure entitled people with expensive suits end up in the right place at the right time. It's a thankless job, but it prevents messy public failures. We handle the reality, so people like you can sell the fantasy." I paused, setting my glass down with a soft click. "Clara has an exceptional eye for quality. In venues, in presentations, and, it would appear, in dinner companions. You must have just missed the cut." The silence that followed was profound. Julian's smile faltered, his confident facade cracking just enough for me to see the flicker of outrage underneath. He had expected me to be intimidated, to be invisible. He hadn't expected me to talk back, let alone to so calmly and precisely dismantle his arrogance. Clara stared at me, her eyes wide with something I couldn't quite decipher. Surprise? Amusement? Respect? Julian recovered quickly, his smile twisting into a sneer. "Cute," he said, though the word lacked any real conviction. He turned back to Clara. "We'll talk later." It was a command, not a suggestion. He gave me one last withering look before turning and stalking away, disappearing back into the shadows of the restaurant. The tension at the table remained, thick and palpable. I braced myself for Clara's reaction. I expected her to be angry, embarrassed, or to tell me I had overstepped. Instead, she just watched me, her head tilted slightly, a small, unreadable smile playing on her lips. The waiter chose that moment to arrive with our main courses, the interruption both a blessing and a curse. We ate in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the clinking of our forks against the plates. Finally, she spoke, her voice low. "I could have handled that myself, you know." "I know," I said, not looking up from my plate. "I just didn't think you should have to." Another silence stretched between us. When I finally risked a glance at her, the guarded mask was gone. In its place was an expression of genuine curiosity, as if she were seeing me for the very first time. The rest of the meal passed in a strange, charged quiet. The easy conversation from before was gone, replaced by something heavier, more significant. We finished our food, skipped dessert, and made our way back to the elevator, the unspoken events of the dinner trailing behind us like a shadow. Back in the ridiculous, opulent suite, the atmosphere was thick with everything that had been left unsaid. The grand space, which had felt comically large before, now felt suffocatingly intimate. Clara walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and stood with her back to me, staring out at the dark, churning sea. The moonlight traced the line of her shoulders, the elegant curve of her neck. I stood awkwardly by the door, my hands shoved in my pockets, feeling like an intruder. "I'm sorry if I overstepped," I said to her back. "With Julian, it wasn't my place." She was silent for a long moment. I could see her reflection in the dark glass, a faint, ghostly image against the backdrop of the night sky. When she finally turned around, her expression was serious, her gaze intense and analytical, as if she were trying to solve a complex puzzle. "You know," she began, her voice soft but clear, cutting through the silence of the room, "most men in that situation would have done one of two things. They would have either tried to puff out their chest and challenge him, turning it into some stupid alpha male contest, or they would have shrunk and apologized for existing." She took a step closer. "You didn't do either. You didn't get aggressive, and you didn't get defensive. You just dismantled him, calmly, precisely, with a single sentence." She was standing in front of me now, so close I could see the flecks of gold in her dark brown eyes. The air crackled with a strange energy. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, unsteady rhythm. "My ex-husband," she continued, her voice dropping even lower, becoming more confidential. "He would have loved a guy like Julian. They were cut from the same cloth. All flash, all ego. He always told me I needed someone who could keep up with me." She shook her head, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "And Sarah, your ex, the one who wanted fireworks." She met my gaze directly, and her eyes were filled with a startling clarity, a perception that felt like it could see right through the careful walls I had built around myself. "She was a fool," Clara said, and the words were not an insult, but a simple, profound statement of fact. She saw predictable and missed the point entirely. That wasn't predictability I saw tonight, Leo. It was centered. It's a kind of strength that doesn't need to announce itself. It's quiet. It's solid. There's a difference. Her words hit me with the force of a physical blow. Centered, not safe, not boring, not predictable. Centered, she had taken my greatest insecurity, the very thing I believed made me unlovable, and reframed it not just as acceptable, but as a virtue, a strength. In that moment, I felt a crack appear in the carefully constructed facade of my life. A tiny fissure, but through it for the first time in years, a sliver of light was getting in. I felt seen, truly, deeply seen, in a way that was both terrifying and exhilarating. I had no idea what to say. The master of words, the woman who could charm any client and win any argument, had rendered me completely speechless. And all I could think was that I was standing in a honeymoon suite with my work rival, and I was in very, very deep trouble. The night that followed was a study in exquisite torture. We retreated to our respective sides of the bed, the vast expanse of white linen between us feeling like a polar ice cap. Sleep was a distant, unattainable country. Every time I closed my eyes, Clara's words echoed in my mind. Centered, a kind of strength, I could feel the warmth of her body radiating from her side of the bed, a magnetic pull I had to consciously resist. I could hear the soft, even rhythm of her breathing. Was she awake too? Was she staring into the darkness, her mind racing like mine? The air was thick with unspoken possibilities, with the ghost of her perception hanging between us. It was the longest night of my life. The next morning, an unspoken truce of professionalism was reinstated. We were Leo and Clara, project leads, there to do a job. We spoke of timelines and budgets, of power outlets and projector screen sizes. But the underlying current was still there. A new awareness flowed between us, a shared secret that colored every interaction. We surveyed the grand ballroom, our footsteps echoing in the empty space. And when her hand brushed against mine as we both reached for a blueprint, the contact was electric, a jolt of static that made us both pull back as if burned. We were inspecting the terrace, a beautiful stone patio overlooking the cliffs, discussing its potential for an outdoor cocktail hour, when he reappeared. Julian. He must have seen us from a window, because he strode out onto the terrace with a predatory purpose, his smile firmly back in place. This time, he didn't even bother with pleasantries. Well, he said, his gaze sweeping over us, lingering for a moment on the fact that we were standing close together, heads bent over the same set of plans. Look at the happy couple. I saw you two coming out of the celestial suite this morning. Tell me, Clara, is this some kind of new corporate team-building exercise I haven't heard about? Or are you really this desperate to try and make me jealous? His voice was loud, intended to carry, to embarrass. He spoke directly to her, completely ignoring me, as if I were a piece of furniture. He was trying to reassert his dominance, to frame our connection, whatever it was, as something cheap, unprofessional, and ultimately all about him. He was trying to steal her agency, to make her a player in his drama. I felt a surge of cold anger, a protective instinct so fierce it startled me. I opened my mouth to say something, to put him in his place again, but Clara was faster. She straightened up to her full height, which wasn't much, but she seemed to grow 2 inches, radiating an aura of pure, undiluted fury. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Her words were like chips of ice. "Julian," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "Let me be perfectly clear, so that even you can understand. My life, my choices, and my business are none of your concern. The only thing I am desperate for is for you to comprehend the simple concept of a closed door." She took a deliberate step to the side, positioning herself so that she was standing slightly in front of me, a subtle but unmistakable gesture of alliance. "Leo is a better man in his little finger than you will ever be in your entire, pathetic, ego-driven existence. And the fact that you can't see that, the fact that you look at him and see nothing, is exactly why you're standing over there, alone, and he's standing here with me." She held his gaze for a beat longer, her eyes blazing. Then, she did something remarkable. She simply turned her back on him. She turned to me, picked up the blueprints, and said, in a perfectly normal, business-like tone, "I think we'll need at least 6 extra heat lamps out here if the reception runs past sunset. What's your opinion, Leo?" It was a masterful dismissal. She hadn't just defended me. She had defended us. She had drawn a line in the sand, placing him firmly on one side and the two of us on the other. Julian was left sputtering, his arrogance deflating like a punctured balloon. He muttered something under his breath and then stormed away, the sound of his expensive shoes clicking angrily on the stone fading into the distance. The air on the terrace vibrated with the aftermath of the confrontation. The pretense of our professional relationship, the flimsy shield we had tried to erect that morning, had been completely shattered. Clara had publicly declared her allegiance, her respect for me. The stakes had been irrevocably raised. We walked back to the suite in silence, the unspoken tension, a third presence walking between us. When the door closed behind us, the grand room felt impossibly small. The unmade king-size bed in the next room was no longer just an awkward piece of furniture. It was a symbol, a silent testament to the intimacy that had been forced upon us and the new, fragile connection that was growing between us. Clara finally broke the silence, her back still to me as she fiddled with some papers on the desk. "I apologize for that," she said, her voice tight. "He's an unfortunate part of my past." "You have nothing to apologize for," I said softly. "What you did back there, thank you." She turned around, and I could see the emotional toll the confrontation had taken. There were faint tremors in her hands, and her eyes looked shadowed. "He was always like that," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Always trying to define me, to put me in a box that suited him. For the longest time, I almost let him. I wanted to go to her, to comfort her, but I was rooted to the spot, terrified of misinterpreting the moment, of crossing a line. The space between us was charged with 1,000 unspoken words, a palpable longing that was as terrifying as it was undeniable. We were no longer just colleagues. We were two people in a honeymoon suite with a shared enemy, a shared secret, and a shared, terrifying spark of something new. And I had no idea what to do next. That evening, the thought of returning to the hotel restaurant was unbearable. The idea of facing the knowing smiles of the staff, of potentially running into Julian again, was more than either of us could stomach. By silent, mutual agreement, we decided on room service. We ate at the small table on the balcony, the setting sun painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The roar of the ocean below provided a constant, soothing soundtrack. We picked at our food, the pretense of discussing work having evaporated completely. The silence between us was no longer awkward or tense, but contemplative, filled with the weight of the day's events. The cool evening breeze felt good on my skin, a welcome contrast to the heat that seemed to be permanently simmering just beneath the surface whenever I was near her. Clara set her fork down and looked out at the horizon, her profile etched against the dying light. She was quiet for a long time, and I let her be, content for once to just exist in the silence with her. When she finally turned to me, her expression was open and serious, stripped of all her usual sarcasm and professional armor. "I have to ask you something, Leo," she said, her voice soft but direct, her gaze unwavering. "And I want you to be honest." I felt my stomach tighten. "Okay." "Back at the check-in desk," she began, her eyes searching mine. "When I told you not to correct them, why did you listen to me? You're Leo Maxwell. You don't do chaos. You don't do mistakes. You could have insisted. You could have straightened it all out in 30 seconds flat and gotten us two separate, sensible rooms. Why didn't you?" It was the question, the one that cut through all the pretense, all the jokes about strategic advantages, and watching me squirm. She was asking for the truth. And in that moment, looking at her in the twilight, with the sound of the sea in my ears and the undeniable pull I felt toward her humming in my veins, I knew I couldn't give her anything less. The carefully constructed walls of my quiet, safe life felt like they were dissolving into dust. I took a deep breath, the salty air filling my lungs. Because a part of me didn't want to, I admitted, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating as they left my lips. A very large, very illogical part of me. I looked down at my hands, then back up at her, forcing myself to meet her gaze. For the last 2 years, I've been living by a set of rules I thought were immutable. I'm a reliable guy, the steady hand, the one who is safe. Sarah didn't just break up with me. She gave me a diagnosis, and I accepted it as fact. I built my life around it. I believed that my quiet nature was a liability in anything other than my job. I paused, gathering my thoughts. But when I'm with you, Clara, it's different. Even when we're in the office, arguing over vendor contracts and budget allocations, I've always felt this. I don't know, this respect from you. You don't just see the result. You see the process. You see the gears turning in my head. You might not agree with my methods, but you never dismiss them. You challenge them. You engage with them. You see me. The last 2 words came out quieter than I intended, full of a vulnerability I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. And being here, in this ridiculous, insane situation, it's been terrifying. But it's also been the first time in a very long time that I've felt awake. And I didn't want it to end. So no, I didn't correct her. I gave a small, self-deprecating shrug. And honestly, I've never really wanted to kiss my work rival before, but here we are. The confession hung in the air between us, raw and honest. Claire didn't look away. She didn't laugh or make a joke. Her expression softened, and a look of profound understanding dawned in her eyes. She slowly, deliberately, stood up from her chair and walked around the small table until she was standing in front of me. She reached out and gently placed her hand on the side of my face, her thumb stroking my cheek. Her touch was feather-light, but it sent a wildfire racing through my veins. "Leo," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. And then she leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't a tentative, hesitant kiss. It was a kiss of confirmation, of mutual surrender. It was slow and deep and breathtaking. It tasted of salt and wine and all the unspoken things that had been simmering between us for months. In that single, perfect moment, all the noise in my head, the insecurities, the ghost of Sarah's words, the fear of being boring, went silent. There was only the feel of Clara's lips on mine, the warmth of her hand on my skin, and the sound of the ocean crashing on the shore below. It wasn't fireworks. It was something better. It was the slow, powerful, inexorable pull of the tide, a force of nature that felt both brand new and as old as time itself. When we finally broke apart, we rested our foreheads together, both of us breathing heavily. The sun had disappeared below the horizon, leaving us in the soft, intimate glow of twilight. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that nothing would ever be the same again. The mistake had been made, and it was the best mistake of my entire life. The rest of the trip passed in a dreamlike haze. The professional line between us had been obliterated, replaced by something infinitely more complex and exhilarating. We finished the site inspection, our conversations now peppered with shared glances and the light, conspiratorial touch of our hands. The massive honeymoon suite no longer felt awkward. It felt like our own private world, a sanctuary from the rest of the hotel. The king-size bed was no longer a demilitarized zone. Returning home was a shock to the system. The sterile fluorescent lights of the office felt harsh and intrusive after the soft, romantic glow of Blackwood Manor. Our colleagues, our routines, the very air of the building seemed to belong to a different lifetime. Clara and I were a secret in plain sight. We exchanged emails about budgets and timelines, but our eyes conveyed a different, silent conversation across the conference room table. The professional rivalry that had once defined our interactions had melted away, replaced by a quiet, supportive partnership. We found ourselves finishing each other's sentences in meetings, anticipating each other's needs on the project. We were becoming a formidable team, our different strengths complementing each other perfectly. A week after our return, I found myself standing outside a florist, staring at a bucket of sunflowers. They were bright, bold, and a little bit wild, and they reminded me of her smile. My heart was pounding with a nervous rhythm I hadn't felt since I was a teenager. This was new territory. Sarah had always preferred roses, a classic, predictable choice. I had never bought a woman's sunflowers in my life. I took a deep breath, walked in, and bought the biggest bunch they had. I asked her to dinner that night. Not a work dinner, not a let's grab a bite text. I called her, my voice feeling strangely formal. I would like to take you on a proper date, I said. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then I heard the smile in her voice. I like that very much, Leo. I didn't take her to a fancy, candlelit restaurant. That felt like trying to replicate the magic of Blackwood Manor, which was impossible. Instead, I took her to a place I loved, a small, slightly chaotic jazz club tucked away in a basement downtown. The music was improvisational and brilliant, the drinks were strong, and the atmosphere was alive and real. It was a part of my world I had never shared with anyone before, a place that defied the predictable label. We sat in a dark corner booth, the music washing over us, and we talked. For the first time, completely away from work and the bizarre circumstances of our meeting, we truly talked. I told her about Sarah, not as a complaint or a sob story, but as an explanation for the man I had become. I told her about my fear of not being enough, of my quiet nature being a fundamental flaw. She listened patiently, her eyes never leaving my face. And then she told me about her ex-husband, a man who, like Julian, had been all charisma and no substance. She spoke of how he tried to mold her, to sand down her sharp edges, to make her a more palatable, less ambitious version of herself. He loved the idea of me, she said, swirling the ice in her glass. But he didn't much care for the reality of me. He wanted to show pony, and I was always a workhorse. In that dark, noisy club, we laid our pasts on the table, not as baggage, but as maps that showed how we had arrived at this point. We were two people who had been profoundly misunderstood by the people who were supposed to love us most. We had both retreated into our work, into being the best at what we did, because it was the one area of our lives where our true natures were rewarded. We were both workhorses, and for the first time, we had found someone who understood the value of that. The weeks that followed were a quiet revelation. Our lives began to merge in small, unassuming ways. She started leaving a tin of her favorite, ridiculously expensive green tea in my apartment. I found myself keeping a bottle of her preferred wine in my fridge, just in case. One Saturday, I spent 8 hours helping her assemble a complicated Scandinavian bookshelf, a task that would have driven a lesser man to madness. We didn't bicker or get frustrated. We worked together, a seamless team, turning the confusing instructions and pile of wooden planks into a thing of beauty and order. It felt like a metaphor for our relationship. The office became our stage. Our newfound partnership made us an unstoppable force on Project Nightingale. We anticipated problems before they arose. We presented a united front to the clients, and we navigated the complex politics of our company with an easy, unspoken synergy. Our boss was thrilled. Our colleagues were baffled. They couldn't understand the sudden, radical shift from frosty rivals to an inseparable team. We just smiled and let them wonder. One rainy Sunday afternoon, we were curled up on my sofa, a mess of blankets and newspapers around us. A half-finished crossword puzzle lay between us. Clara was leaning against me, her head on my shoulder, her warmth a comforting weight. A sappy old movie was playing on the television, but neither of us was watching. "You know," she said quietly into the comfortable silence, "I never thought this was what I wanted. A half-finished crossword and a man who alphabetizes his spice rack." I teased. She laughed, a soft, warm sound that filled my small apartment with more joy than it had ever known. "No," she said, tilting her head to look up at me. The quiet, the ease of it. I spent so many years chasing the noise, the challenge, the next big thing. I thought that's what happiness was. A destination you had to fight to reach. She settled back against me, her sigh one of pure contentment. It turns out happiness isn't a destination. It's a place to come home to. I tightened my arm around her, pulling her closer. My apartment had never felt like a home until she was in it. I had been the king of my quiet, solitary kingdom, but I had been a lonely king. With Clara, the quiet wasn't empty anymore. It was full of shared understanding, witty banter, and the peaceful, steady rhythm of two hearts beating in sync. I was still the logistics guy. I was still the man who found comfort in order and planning. But I was no longer just safe, I was centered, and I was loved for it. 2 years later, the air on the balcony was just as I remembered it, thick with the scent of salt and pine. The sea below churned with the same timeless, powerful rhythm. But this time, everything was different. I was wearing a tuxedo, the collar feeling a little too tight, and Clara was standing beside me, not in a business suit or a denim jacket, but in a simple, elegant white dress that seemed to shimmer in the late afternoon light. Her hair was down, curling over her shoulders, and her smile was the brightest thing I had ever seen. We had come back to Blackwood Manor. We had booked the celestial honeymoon suite, this time on purpose. Our wedding ceremony had been a small, intimate affair on the stone terrace just below, the same terrace where she had so fiercely defended us from Julian. Our closest friends and family had watched as we said our vows, the words feeling not like a beginning, but like a confirmation of something that had been true for a very long time. After the ceremony, we had stolen away, back to our suite, back to the balcony where it had all really started. I watched her as she leaned on the railing, looking out at the view. The past 2 years replayed in my mind like a movie montage. Moving in together, adopting a scruffy, one-eared rescue dog we named Nightingale, winning the industry's top award for the very event that had brought us here. We hadn't just built a life. We had built an empire, both professionally and personally. The quiet, gray world I had once inhabited was now a distant memory, replaced by a life so full of color and warmth and laughter that I sometimes couldn't believe it was mine. I was no longer the man who was afraid of not being enough. I was simply a man who was loved. Clara turned from the railing, her eyes sparkling with a familiar, mischievous light. "So," she said, stepping closer and looping her arms around my neck. "Still think this was all a mistake?" I smiled, pulling her close, the fabric of her dress soft against my hands. I leaned in and rested my forehead against hers, breathing in the scent of her, the clean, green fragrance that had captivated me on that cramped airplane so long ago. "It was the best mistake I never corrected," I whispered. She laughed, the sound carried away by the sea breeze. She kissed me then, a kiss that was full of joy and promise and the deep, abiding comfort of coming home. I had spent so much of my life believing I was the quiet, predictable background character in someone else's grand, exciting story. I thought love was about fireworks and grand gestures, things that were completely alien to my nature. But I had been wrong. Love wasn't about changing who you are. It was about finding the one person who sees you, truly sees you, and recognizes your quiet predictability not as a flaw, but as a strength. It was about finding the person who looks at your carefully centered world and doesn't want to disrupt it, but wants to move in and build a life there with you. It was about realizing that the most exciting thing in the world wasn't a sudden explosion, but the slow, steady, and profound burn of being completely and utterly seen.